those who leave their doors unlocked. The small town of Osterville, Massachusetts, early autumn. Osterville has always been known for its peaceful lifestyle. There had never been any high-profile crimes here, and people believed their town was a safe place. So safe, in fact, that many residents left their doors unlocked even at night. The Martin family, who lived on the outskirts of town, followed this tradition. The head of the family, Thomas, believed that locks were unnecessary. "If something happens to us, the neighbors will hear," he liked to say. But the events that began on one quiet evening forced them to reconsider everything. It all started at the end of September. That evening, Lily, the youngest daughter, couldn't fall asleep. She was 10 years old and afraid of the dark, but she always tried to be brave. Lying in her bed, she heard a sound like a door creaking. "It's probably the wind," she thought. But soon she heard footsteps. Quiet, slow, as if someone was moving down the hallway. "Dad?" Lily asked, but there was no answer. She pulled the blanket over her head and closed her eyes tightly. In the morning, she told her mother about it, but her mother dismissed it as a child's fantasy. The next day, the family noticed something strange. Someone had left dirty footprints under the kitchen table. Thomas laughed and said it was probably Jake, the eldest son, who hadn't wiped his feet after going for a walk. But Jake insisted he hadn't been in the kitchen. "The cat could have brought in the dirt," suggested her mother. However, the footprints were too big for an animal. They were barefoot footprints. The second night began as usual. Jake, the eldest son, stayed up late playing video games. His parents and Lily were already asleep, and the house was silent, broken only by the steady clicking of the game controller buttons. The clock read 1:45 when Jake decided it was time to call a night. He turned off the console, stretched, and suddenly heard a strange sound. It was laughter, quiet but distinct. It came from the first floor, as if in the living room. Maybe Mom forgot to turn off the TV? Jake thought. He cautiously left his room and froze in the doorway. The house seemed dark and unusually quiet, except for the laughter. The boy started down the stairs, but froze halfway down when he noticed something moving in the hallway. Jake's gaze was drawn to the movement by the living room window. It seemed to him that someone was looking into the house from the street. A second later, he saw the curtains sway slowly, as if someone had just touched them. The laughter suddenly stopped. There was a silence that seemed even more frightening. Jake gathered his courage and approached the window. It was pitch black outside, and he couldn't see anything behind the glass. But when he reached out to pull the curtains closed, something white flashed on the street. The boy jumped back, his heart racing. "Who's there?" he whispered, not expecting an answer. In response, a new sound broke the silence. It was a whisper, barely audible, but it definitely came from behind the door. Jake listened, but couldn't make out the words. The whisper sounded like someone repeating the same thing over and over again. Jake looked around in panic. All the doors and windows were closed, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was already inside the house. When the boy went to the light switch to turn on the light, the bulb flickered and went out. Now the living room was completely dark. Only the moonlight shining through the window illuminated the room. Suddenly, he heard a sound behind him, a slow, drawn-out creak, as if someone had opened a door. Jake turned around but saw nothing unusual. However, the door to the storage room, which was always closed, was now ajar. The boy slowly approached the door, holding a flashlight in his hand. When he shone it inside, there was nothing in the closet, just a broom and some old boxes. But as he was about to close the door, a faint sound came from the depths of the room. It was the same laughter. Jake rushed upstairs, not wanting to check the storage room any further. He decided to wake his parents, but when he ran to their bedroom, he found the door closed. The boy began to knock, but there was no answer. He grabbed the handle, but the door wouldn't budge, as if someone had locked it from the inside. "Mom? Dad?" Jake called, but all he heard in response was the same quiet whisper, which now sounded right behind him. He spun around, but the hallway was empty. Summoning all his courage, Jake decided to go back downstairs to check the locks on the door and call the police. But when he got downstairs, the front door was wide open. A man was standing on the porch just inside the doorway. He didn't move, just stared at him with huge dark eyes. "You left the door open," he whispered in a voice that sounded both close and distant. Jake blinked, and the man disappeared. When he told his parents about it the next morning, they just dismissed it. Thomas suggested that it was a dream, but Jake was sure that something or someone had come into the house that night. The only evidence that it wasn't a figment of his imagination were the barefoot footprints on the floor near the pantry and on the porch. The Martins began to feel that someone was watching them, and the doors, which they had left open for years, began to seem like an entrance for something uninvited and dangerous. A couple of days later, the Martins learned that they were not the only ones experiencing unexplained events. Their neighbors, the Owens, said they also heard footsteps at night. Joanna Owen claimed she saw someone's shadow near her bedroom, but, thinking it was a dream, she didn't think much of it. They remembered an old urban legend. Osterville had long kept the secret of Lawrence Gray, a man whom the locals referred to as nothing less than a strange recluse. Lawrence lived on the outskirts of town in an old house he had built himself. The house stood on an abandoned farm surrounded by wild forest. No one knew exactly where he came from, but it was clear from the start that he was not looking for company. Lawrence never went into town to shop. He obtained everything he needed himself. Sometimes he was seen at the town market, trading furs and firewood for grain or candles. Neighbors said he was tall, with a thick beard and piercing eyes that made them feel uncomfortable. But what frightened people most was his silence. Lawrence almost never spoke, and when he did utter a few words, his voice sounded dry and hoarse. Rumors about Lawrence multiplied over the years. It was said that he had lost his family in tragic circumstances. One of the most popular stories claimed that his wife and 2 children had died in a fire in his first home, which was in another state. After that, Lawrence, distraught with grief, sold all his possessions and moved to a place where no one knew him. But there were also those who believed that he was not a victim of circumstances, but the cause of the tragedy. People saw something frightening in his silence and behavior. "He's hiding his sins," they whispered, although there was no evidence of this. Some claimed that Lawrence was obsessed with protecting himself and his home from evil. He spent his nights carving amulets and burning strange symbols into the trees around his farm. The residents saw his work and shunned it. The symbols resembled ancient signs similar to those mentioned in occult books. The death of Lawrence Gray became yet another mystery that added to the list of rumors in Osterville. One autumn, about 20 years before the events involving the Martin family, Lawrence suddenly stopped appearing in town. A week passed, then another, and finally one of his neighbors decided to check on him. The door to Gray's house was unlocked. When the neighbor entered, he saw that the house was completely empty. There was no furniture, no belongings, and no Lawrence himself. Only a small rag doll and several charred candles arranged in a circle remained on the floor. A few days later, his body was found in the woods, about a mile from his farm. It was lying near an old oak tree, around which were carved the very symbols that Gray often used. In his hands, he clutched a child's toy, a tiny wooden horse. The doctors who examined the body found no obvious signs of violent death, although his face was frozen in horror. They concluded that Lawrence had died of a heart attack, but the locals believed otherwise. After his death, Gray's house stood abandoned for several years. Several families tried to move in, but no one stayed for long. It was said that at night, footsteps, creaking doors, and faint children's laughter could be heard in the house. Eventually, the house was demolished, but that did not rid Osterville of its memories of Lawrence. It was believed that his spirit remained in these places and was now looking for a way to return to other people's homes. This legend was passed down from generation to generation, and after the strange events involving the Martin family, it took on a new life. People in the town increasingly associated unexplained phenomena with the fact that Lawrence Gray, even after his death, had not abandoned his habit of entering places where the doors were left open. After the events of the second night, Thomas, the head of the family, decided to be on guard. His persistence rubbed off on the rest of the family. The Martins checked all the doors and windows before going to bed, making sure they were closed. Even Jake, who had previously dismissed the oddities, was clearly alarmed. But that night, something sinister returned. It was around 3 in the morning when Lily woke up to the sound of footsteps. Heavy, measured footsteps came from below, as if someone was calmly walking through the living room. She froze, listening. The footsteps grew louder, but then suddenly stopped. For a second, there was dead silence. At that moment, Jake woke up to the creak of his door. It was ajar, and through the crack he saw the figure of a tall man. The man stood motionless, but Jake could clearly feel that he was being watched. "Who's there?" he asked hoarsely. The man did not answer, but stepped back and disappeared into the darkness of the hallway. Jake woke his father, and together they went to inspect the house. Thomas held a heavy lantern in his hands, and Jake followed behind, trying not to fall behind. When they went downstairs, everything looked normal, except for one detail. The front door was open again. "We locked it," Thomas whispered. He walked closer and saw footprints on the carpet. They were large, like those of an adult man, and led to the kitchen. The kitchen was empty, but Thomas noticed that the window, which was always closed at night, was now ajar. It looked as if someone had climbed through it. Then Thomas's flashlight flickered, and for a moment a shadow flashed in the corner of the kitchen. "Who are you?" Thomas asked loudly, shining the light there, but the corner was empty. At that moment, they heard a sound from upstairs. It was a creak, as if someone was slowly opening the door to Lily's bedroom. Thomas and Jake ran upstairs. When they reached Lily's room, the girl was sitting on her bed, trembling. "There's a man in there," she whispered, pointing to the wardrobe. Thomas threw open the closet doors, but it was empty. However, on the inside of the door, someone had drawn something with the tip of a knife, a circle with symbols similar to those mentioned in the rumors about Lawrence Gray. "What the hell is this?" Thomas muttered, looking at the drawing. Going back downstairs, Thomas wanted to check the doors again. But when he approached the living room, his blood ran cold. A man was standing in the middle of the room, tall, with a thick beard, dressed in a long, tattered cloak. His eyes shone in the darkness, and his face expressed a strange calmness. "Lawrence Gray," Thomas breathed, recognizing the figure from old descriptions. The man took a step forward, and Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "You leave the doors open," Lawrence said in a low, hollow voice. "It's an invitation." Thomas tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. Meanwhile, Jake stood behind him, watching the scene with horror. "What do you want?" Thomas finally managed to say. Lawrence smiled. "I haven't left," he said, pointing to the floor. They looked down and noticed that under the carpet, which had never been touched before, there was another symbol. It was exactly the same as the one in the closet. For a moment, the lights in the house went out. When they came back on, Lawrence was gone. It was as if he had never been there. But traces remained, both on the carpet and in the Martins' hearts, who now knew that their house was part of something bigger. The next morning, they decided to talk to the town's elders to learn more about the symbols and how Lawrence's death was connected to their house. In the morning, the Martins turned to the elders of Osterville. Mrs. Glenda, an elderly woman who had lived in the town all her life, was one of the few who knew the story of Lawrence Gray. She listened attentively to their story and remained silent for a long time, looking at her trembling hands. "Lawrence was obsessed," she finally said. "He said he saw signs. It was believed that he drew them to protect himself, but now I think they didn't protect him, but rather held something back." "What exactly?" Thomas asked. Glenda shook her head. "Legend has it that Lawrence crossed the boundary between our world and one that is better left undisturbed. He lived alone not because he didn't like people, but because he was afraid that his darkness would escape." Mrs. Glenda said that before he died, Lawrence said that something was watching him. He locked himself in a circle of symbols, hoping to keep the evil inside, but it consumed him. "His spirit may have remained here," she added. "If you saw him in your house, then this place is somehow connected to his rituals." Thomas decided to investigate and find out what their house was hiding. He remembered the strange symbol they had found under the carpet and decided to check the entire space. With Jake's help, he lifted the floorboard under the carpet. Underneath was a small niche, and in it was a burnt book with yellowed pages. The book was in Latin, but some pages had notes in English. They described strange rituals capable of sealing the border or holding back the shadows. But what alarmed Thomas most was the drawing of a house, their house. Underneath, it was an inscription: "Preserve the circle, or they will come." That night, Thomas decided not to go to bed. Thomas sat in the living room, holding his grandfather's rifle on his lap. The light bulb on the table glowed dimly, and the wind howled outside the window. It seemed to him that the house was breathing with him, creaking with wooden beams and whispers echoing off the walls. The clock struck midnight, and everything around him seemed to freeze. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. At that very moment, he heard something fall in the kitchen. Taking a flashlight, Thomas headed toward the noise. He walked slowly, trying not to wake his family. The flashlight illuminated the dark hallway, casting long shadows. When he reached the kitchen, there was no one there. But there was a broken cup on the floor, the same one Lily had been drinking milk from the day before. Thomas picked it up and noticed something strange. There were wet marks on the table, as if someone had run their hand across it. Turning toward the basement door, he noticed that it was ajar. "Who's there?" Thomas asked, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. The only response was silence. Plucking up his courage, Thomas went downstairs. The steps creaked under his feet, and the air in the basement was musty and heavy. When a lantern illuminated the space, he saw that the floor was covered with a layer of dust, except for one area. On the floor, surrounded by glowing symbols, stood old candles, still smoldering as if they had just been extinguished. In the center of the circle, as if carved out of the shadows of the night, stood Lawrence Gray. His figure seemed unreal, tall, bearded, dressed in a worn cloak that seemed to be part of the darkness itself. His eyes were empty, like deep wells that reflected no light. "You have crossed the boundary," he said in a voice that echoed. "You have opened a door that should not be opened." Thomas raised his rifle and aimed it at the figure. "Who are you? What do you want?" he asked, trying to sound confident. Lawrence did not move. "You've gotten yourself into something you don't understand. You've broken the circle," he continued. "Now, they're here." "Who are they?" Thomas shouted. At that moment, the air in the basement became heavy. The light bulb above began to flicker, and shadows stretched out from the corners of the room. They moved like living creatures, crawling toward the center of the circle, hissing and uttering barely audible words. "They've been waiting a long time," Lawrence continued. "A very long time." Thomas realized he had to act. He shot Lawrence, but the bullet passed through him and hit the wall. At that moment, the figure disappeared, leaving only a bright, glowing circle. He rushed upstairs to check on his family. In the children's room, Jake was standing by Lily's bed, shielding her with his body. "What's going on?" he shouted, but Thomas didn't have time to answer. In the corner of the room stood the figure of Lawrence. He reached out to the children, but did not come closer, as if something was holding him back. Thomas noticed that he was standing on the edge of the carpet where the symbol had been found earlier. "The circle!" Thomas shouted. "The symbol is holding him back." Thomas realized that if the circle was broken, the shadows would be set free. He told Jake and Lily to leave the room, and he began hastily drawing symbols on the floor with chalk. The shadows around them began to move faster, resembling clouds of smoke. "That won't stop them." Lawrence's voice rang out. Thomas closed the circle and shouted, "Why are you here? Why are they following you?" Lawrence replied, "I tied them to this place. Now they are bound to the house." Suddenly, the lights in the house went out, and everything was plunged into pitch darkness. Thomas felt something cold touch his shoulder. When the lights came back on, Lawrence had disappeared. All that remained was the burnt book that the family had found earlier. The symbols on its pages glowed red. Thomas picked up the book and realized that it was the key to freeing the house. He opened it, and the pages began to turn by themselves. On one of them, he saw instructions. To get rid of the shadows, he had to burn the book in the place where they first appeared. Thomas gathered his family and headed to the basement. He placed the book in the center of a circle and lit it. The flame flared up, but it was black as night itself. At that moment, the shadows began to moan, and the whole house shook. When it was over, only dust remained where the book had been. The shadows disappeared, and the symbols on the floor no longer glowed. The family left the house that same night. They did not know if Lawrence had been banished for good or if his spirit still roamed Osterville. But one thing they knew for sure: the doors must always be kept closed. I would like to apologize in advance for any errors in the text or dubbing. I am still learning, and the language used on this channel is not my native language. The dubbing was done using artificial intelligence. Please point out any errors so that I can correct them and improve the quality of the content. I would also be happy if you shared your thoughts on the topic. Your support in the comments motivates me to continue searching for new interesting stories. Thank you for your understanding and participation. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new stories.